Is a dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Pioneers. Today's TEFL pioneer is Daniel Jones. So he was a phonetician who was born in 1881 and died in 1967. He was one of the kind of a group of people who we've talked about before. So, for example, Henry Sweet, who we spoke about in episode 2, Charles Fries, who we spoke about in episode 3, and so on. He studied at Cambridge and he received a BA in mathematics, which he converted to an MA by payment. That doesn't count, does it?
Oh, right. That's how it used to work.
Yeah, no, it still looks like that at Cambridge and
MA,
Oxford.
what's it called?
MA Oxon or something.
Okay.
Ox cab.
Is that what it sounds like? You just pay?
Yeah, well, after a few years, they just automatically upgrade it to an MA by a sort of, like, you have to pay a nominal fee.
I see.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's a bit annoying.
Okay.
So he studied under a guy called Paul Passy, who I hadn't heard of, but apparently he was quite an important linguist. And Paul Passy was one of the founders of the International Phonetic Association. After studying under Paul Passy, he actually married Paul Passy's niece, which I thought was quite funny.
Okay.
An interesting point about Daniel Jones's life, I found this from Wikipedia, is, so I'll quote the Wikipedia article directly. A point of interest is that it is probably Daniel Jones, and not, as is often thought, Henry Sweet, who provided George Bernard Shaw with the basis for his fictional character Henry Higgins in Pygmalion.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if the page for Henry Sweet says the same sentence, but just the names removed.
Perhaps.
I do remember with Henry Sweet, like all these things, he's the character in Pygmalion is an amalgamation of a bunch of people. So probably each of those people claim ownership or
Yeah. Well, he did actually study under Henry Sweet for a while, as I just said. So perhaps part of Henry Sweet's horrible character rubbed off on him.
Right.
So he became a lecturer at University College London in 1907 and became the head of the Department of Phonetics in 1912. And later he became a member of the International Phonetic Association and stayed as the president of that association until his death. So that's some of his background.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'll talk about his contributions a little bit. So perhaps there's 2 points that he's very famous for. The first of them is a book that he wrote called The Outline of English Phonetics in 1918. And that's important because it was the first full description of received pronunciation. Yeah. So are you guys familiar with received pronunciation? I assume so.
Yeah.
Yes. Would you like to give us
I don't think I speak in received pronunciation, but I'm aware of it's quite a dominant. It still probably is quite a dominant model in English.
Dominant in what way?
People refer back to it or refer to it as a kind of a marker of good spoken English. I think that and standard American is still quite relied upon.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be, but it is.
Yes. So he wrote the first full description of received pronunciation, which was also, as it happens, the first description of the standard pronunciation of any language. It was the first full description of a standard pronunciation, like preceding American English.
Which year was this? Is there a year?
1918.
1918.
What's the definition of a standard pronunciation?
Well, what would be considered a standard? I'm not exactly sure what definition he was using, but whatever would be considered a standard that you could measure other dialects against.
I see.
So a normative.
Right. My understanding of RP is that it's certainly probably not the most common pronunciation.
Yeah, but it is considered a standard. It's kind of like a yardstick. How long is the yardstick? What's a yard? You measure a yardstick as a yard. You measure a yard with a yardstick. So he was a phonetician, as I said. He was the first linguist to use the word phoneme in its modern sense.
Okay.
It was interesting.
Yeah.
And he also wrote the English Pronouncing Dictionary, which is still in print. And this leads on to the second point, which I think was quite influential, was he invented the cardinal vowel diagram.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
The kind of rhombus-y shaped thing?
This thing here that I have in front of me.
It's probably not a rhombus.
The listeners can't see. It's like a sort of a trapezium sort of
Trapezium
shape.
sounds better.
Yeah. So do you want to quickly describe
It looks
that?
like a chocolate bar in perspective.
Perspective. Right.
Like on the ceiling.
Yeah,
like the Star Destroyer at the beginning of Star Wars.
yeah.
Zooming over us. Yeah.
Anyway,
My understanding is that it's kind of a map of the human mouth in terms of the positioning of the tongue and how open the mouth is.
Yeah.
To describe how we make different vowel sounds.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure all the listeners of this have used this or used this in their training courses at least.
Yeah.
And another thing that he did with his descriptions of vowel sounds was he made a recording of the cardinal vowels for HMV in 1917.
All right. His master's voice.
Yes,
I see.
exactly. Maybe his voice was the master's.
I thought it was that dog. Oh no.
That dog was listening to just the vowels. That certainly is an ah. So yeah, those were his two contributions: his description of received pronunciation and his invention of the cardinal vowel diagram.
Okay.
So, how influential would you say those have been in your teaching?
That's a good question.
I mean, this particular diagram, I don't think I've used it in my teaching.
Yeah.
I think people doing like deltas or teaching certificates probably use this in their training.
Yeah.
I don't think in my teaching I've ever used it with learners. I don't know what learners would get from this.
Yeah, I've never used
Quite
this diagram. I think maybe to model. I think what's interesting about this is to model sounds, to model phonemes. And I think Adrian Underhill talks about this really nicely. That just kind of reminding students that it's a physical act. They shouldn't think too much about it, and just focus on the shape of their mouth and where sounds are being made in their mouths.
Well, there's another diagram too. I think it's called a sagittal diagram, when it's like a cutaway of the mouth,
Right.
and the whole face as well. I think that's probably more useful.
Yeah.
So I don't know which one came first.
I think this one came first.
This one, yeah.
I think the other one's based on this one.
Right. Okay.
But apparently this is being questioned quite a lot.
Oh, really?
And people are now saying, or perhaps have been saying for a few decades, that Jones wasn't completely right in the way he was kind of envisioning vowels, and it's more of a three-dimensional thing as opposed to something you can display in a trapezoid diagram.
Yeah. A two-dimensional.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What's a three-dimensional trapezoid called?
Trapezoid 3D.
Yeah.
Within 3D.
In 3D.
Part 3.
So perhaps another influence or another reason that he was an important figure in the field of language teaching was because he went on to mentor quite a lot of linguists and phoneticians. One of his trainees was Harold Palmer, who we spoke about, who came and influenced the Japanese education system quite a lot. Another one who I'm going to speak about a little bit, even though he's quite a minor figure, was a guy called Clive Sansom. It's kind of a difficult, I won't say Samson, but it was Sansom.
Okay.
So he was a guy who studied under Daniel Jones, and then joined the Speech Fellowship, which was an organisation in London dedicated to teaching people enunciation and received pronunciation. And they went to countries around the world and taught the received pronunciation dialect of English. They also did it in such places as the north of England and areas to try and help people get jobs and things like that, and pronounce their words in a way that was considered proper and correct. And one of the people who worked with Clive Sansom was a woman called Hilda Adams, who wrote books and taught enunciation and judged poetry contests and things like that. And she was my grandmother.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So that's something I found out. Yeah. You can get her books online if you want. They're quite expensive.
Okay.
There's only about 3 of them.
You should be able to get a few.
I've got some, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we don't have to...
No, you can borrow mine, so I'll lend them to you.
Signed?
No, unfortunately. I can sign them, and then it's like a signature down through history.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those are the main contributions of Daniel Jones to the field. He was a pioneer in terms of his description of received pronunciation, which has become the model of a lot of language teaching, or in the past at least.
Yeah.
He created the vowel diagram, which they still use in pronunciation teaching to this day, at least teacher training. And he mentored a lot of people who went on to do some quite interesting things in the field. So that's our TEFL pioneer for this week,
right?
Daniel Jones. TEFL cultures.
So for today's TEFL culture, I'd like to talk about the concept. It's more of a concept than a methodology. A concept called language play.
Right.
Ask you the question. Are you familiar with language play?
No.
Okay, it's a weird question to ask.
Okay.
I'll begin by asking you two a couple of questions. So, Rob, as a Japanese learner, when you come across a new item of vocabulary, maybe you've been taught it by the teacher, or it's in a text that you've read. What do you do to try and automatize that language?
It's an interesting question because I have a lot of problems with remembering Japanese vocabulary. What I'll try and do is use it in a variety of different sentences. I'll try and squeeze it into conversations that I have with people in as unnatural way as possible to try and make sure it sticks in my head. I also will try to write using that word because learning the Chinese characters, the kanji, helps me to visualize the words a lot. So I try to use it in writing. Yeah. Those are the main ways that I do it.
And Matt, perhaps I'll ask you, your daughter, when she learns a new word in English, what does she do with that word? Do you notice her like taking risks with that word? Or?
It really varies. Depends on the word and maybe how she learns it.
Right. Okay.
So some words she just kind of picks up, and you can just kind of notice her using it more or less straight away, fairly accurately. She's 4 years old. Other words, she picks up through books or songs. One example I can think of just at the moment is the word enchanted.
Okay.
Which appeared in the song. The line is the enchanted one. And she started singing it as, what did she say? The cheddar box? For some reason to her it sounded like the cheddar box.
Cheddar.
Cheddar box. We think she was saying.
Okay.
Right.
And then from cheddar box we got chatterbox. But then also I tried to explain her the phrase was the enchanted one,
right? And
then had to kind of explain what enchanted meant, and then she was kind of really interested in this phrase, and she would sometimes stick with the correct phrase, the enchanted one, but then also kind of play around with going back to cheddar box.
Right, I see. So that leads nicely into today's TEFL culture, which is all about language play. Guy Cook, who you might be familiar with, he wrote an article in 1997 talking. He perhaps came up with this concept in 1997.
Right.
And he defines language play as being both formal and semantic.
Okay.
So, for example, at a formal level, you can play with patterns of rhyme, rhythm, assonance, and alliteration.
Right.
And you can play around with grammatical structures. And at a semantic level, you play around with the units of meaning, combining them in ways which create new worlds which do not exist.
Okay.
Fictions, for example. Yeah. So that's kind of what your daughter was doing. She was kind of playing around with these cheddar boxes and quite weird concept. Yeah. So what Guy Cook is arguing is this is something that we should be perhaps doing more in our classes, not focusing on the real and known meaning, but playing around with kind of unreal or inauthentic uses of language as a way to kind of build up, I guess, interest in learning languages.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. There was I read an article in English Teaching Professional magazine recently where the writer was saying that, we're always saying we have to give students authentic examples of language, especially for teaching vocabulary and stuff. They've got to be in the kind of situations students would encounter them. And he said it might actually be better to just give them in these really contrived, silly, ridiculous sentences because students are more likely to remember them.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's essentially what language play is. So it's an integrated element of language learning that seeks to blur the distinctions between work and play.
Right.
It fosters the construction of novel thought, and that leads to kind of a more positive social awareness of language learning.
Right.
Language play encourages exploration beyond safe and known forms and an overemphasis on accuracy.
Okay.
So gets learners not to think about the accurate use and the accurate setting for the language, but to kind of play around with the shape of the language.
Right. I guess in playing with it, they're still paying attention to.
So the thing about this is, they're still focusing on form. There's a high degree of repetition, but also manipulation too. And that's kind of what's encouraged with this approach. And it's kind of a difficult concept to kind of get your head around because it doesn't really exist, in a sense. Obviously we can see where some language leads us, obviously in like particular real world tasks. That's kind of thing. That's what a lot of teachers tend to stick on when they're teaching. How does this language result to this in the real world?
Right.
Essentially, in kind of a communicative approach, that's what most people do. But Guy Cook and some other people have argued that maybe we need to play around with these parameters a little bit and create what they call a safe house for play in the classroom, essentially.
Like a Wendy house.
Yes.
The little language dolls inside.
Yeah.
But they even though they say players could be anything, there still needs to be some conditions in place as well, which I will now talk about. So language play, it can't be forced on learners, but they should be invited to play within a safe play frame. So for example, if
Sorry, just thinking of like a climbing frame.
It kind of is in a sense, What Guy Cook argues is that I think there's like a lot of people these days are saying they want to make the classroom as real as possible. This is the real world in the classroom. I think like Guy Cook and some others have argued that this isn't the case. It's an artificial place anyway, and we should be kind of
But in a way, they are arguing for kind of authentic language use because this is. I mean, as we discussed, that's what people do, especially in first language acquisition. Little kids play with the language.
That's the thing. Well, they argue that this leads to like better more authentic authenticity. Authenticity.
More authentic authenticity.
So Guy Cook makes the argument that language classes are indeed artificial environments, much like other forms of play for adults and children. For example, a quote from his 1997 article. A child may shoot another child dead in play, and then have
or not,
and then have an ice cream with him afterwards. And two adults do battle on the squash court and then drink beer in the bar as best friends. So you can kind of see they have these two separate constructs. They have the real world and then they have the play world. And I think he's kind of arguing that the two do overlap and they complement one another.
Right.
Essentially.
Is it a bit like how we pretend to get on this podcast, but afterwards we just go our separate ways and never speak to each other?
Yeah,
it's like
exactly that basically. and they're even saying that language play itself, sometimes communication, the sake of interaction is just to create, just to have fun, just to be funny.
I think, did we talk about that on another episode? This idea of things that violate some of Grice's maxims. Things don't always have to have a purpose.
Right.
And they don't always have to be true.
This is one reason why they argue language play might be good in the class, because you can commit face-threatening acts in this kind of safe house of language play.
But then afterwards you're friends again, after you've threatened someone's face.
So for example, they argue that language play is a good way to bring in other voices. For example, change the register. For example, in the context of Japan, we have this idea of keigo, which means honorific language. And within the language classroom, whether it be Japanese or English, you can kind of play around with those forms. Something that you couldn't do outside of the classroom.
Right.
And they're kind of saying that this is a good thing. Basically. Other points to argue for language play is that language play may lower effective barriers to SLA by providing a means of lessening anxiety, thus allowing linguistic data to pass through the affective filter, one of Krashen's ideas, and become intake. And it also fosters risk-taking.
Right. Yeah.
Are there any examples of language play?
I came across, there was one guy, his name was Cade Bushnell from the University of Hawaii, and he conducted some action research and observed classes with learners that were learning Japanese as a foreign language. So the teacher was trying to teach the word kegel, which we just talked about, honorific language.
Yeah.
I think the teacher was trying to teach the actual form of the word. Do you remember what this means?
Okay.
We were studying this word, kegel, last week.
Right.
This was all in Japanese. And the teacher, at the same time, she could see that the students weren't really understanding. So she kind of said, she made a joke. She said, like a kegel, like that, and the students laughed. And then the students accused her of buying a keg of beer, and they laughed about that. And then another student said, don't play with my kegel, followed by a further student saying, Lego my kegel.
Okay.
I mean, it's nonsensical, but I think what they're arguing with this point is people are going to remember this event. They're going to remember this kind of funny exchange or playfulness with the language.
Yeah.
And it might arguably lead to them remembering what they actually should be learning, essentially. Or perhaps it opens space for them to learn what they should be learning, arguably. So that's one example.
Right. So that's an example of kind of taking the opportunity to use humor in the classroom to make something more memorable.
Yes, yeah.
This idea of language, play makes me think of games.
Yeah.
I wonder if there are kind of specific language games.
I mean,
designed for using language in creative or odd ways.
I don't know much about language games. However, a colleague that we work with has designed a kind of a practice stage of his lesson that's built around this idea of language play. So, for example, he teaches on a discussion program, and he wanted to teach his students how to change topics smoothly.
Right.
But rather than giving them the form of changing topic, the function in a dialogue to do with the lesson topic, he put in lots of well-known Japanese comedians and made them speak quite rudely to one another.
Right.
And the students found this funny. They could notice that the form was on this changing topic.
Yeah.
And he argues that this kind of practice activity or presentation activity led to better use further in the course, the lesson. So that's one example. Regarding games, I'm not too sure about. Do you have any example of games that you've obviously games are fun, in a sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, but.
I mean, it's interesting, like talking about accusations of it being less authentic. Kind of examples I can think of are activities I've done with younger kids, and they are kind of nonsensical.
Right. Yeah.
Students pretending to be monsters or robots or whatever. Those kind of things, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent a lot of my time teaching business English, where I don't think they'd react well. I think a lot of the students I've taught, if I started doing, like now we're going to be dragons or whatever, I think they wouldn't respond well to that in that case.
Yeah.
I mean, I have used games, but I think they've been a bit more focused. So it's not so much you are it's not like the kind of game you were talking about there, where it's like comedians or whatever. It's more like role playing.
Role plays, right?
Yeah. Things that are more serious, but they're still kind of slightly fantastical situations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they're arguing here is it's just another way to get to that language, to focus on form.
Right.
Okay, so language play, that's today's TEFL cultures.
TEFL news.
Today's TEFL news is about Pearson. You guys are familiar with Pearson, the publisher.
The publisher.
Yeah. One of the biggest publishing things in the world.
Publishing houses.
Yeah. So they recently conducted a bit of research. They surveyed over 6,000 English language learners from 12 countries, and basically they wanted to understand more about why and how these students choose to learn English as a second language. Okay. So they asked some interesting questions. Things like, who's the best female music artist to help you learn English? Who's the best male music artist? What the best male female? The best male female. The best band, the best movie, the best TV program. Who is your ideal language learner, celebrity language learner? Okay, so maybe we can look at some of these ideas. So who do you think they chose as celebrity English teacher?
First of all, who did they ask? What kind of?
I don't know.
demographic?
I think it seems maybe slightly younger, but maybe university age.
Yeah, people from several different countries.
Celebrity, who they'd like to be taught.
Yeah, who they think would be a good celebrity English teacher.
Based on what my students say, I'm going to say Taylor Swift. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Based on One Direction.
Maybe, I don't know, Paul McCartney, perhaps?
Yeah, maybe it was actually, they published it this year. Maybe it was conducted a little while ago. Number one was Bill Gates.
Oh, really?
Who narrowly beat out Barack Obama.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
They 42% thought that William Shakespeare demonstrated the best mastery of the English language.
Not William Shatner.
Not William Shatner. Adele was top of the female artist. Justin Timberlake top of the male artist. Mm-hmm. The Beatles, unsurprisingly, surprisingly, the best man. To be honest, this is all I'm burying the lead. This is all a bit of fluff that Pearson did as a way to introduce something they developed, and I think they've started using this year, called the Global Scale of English. Have you heard of this?
No.
The GSE. Basically, what they've decided they want to do, and I think it's part of their push to kind of standardize as much as possible everything and assign numbers to as many things as possible.
Yeah.
The Global Scale of English, what they call the world's first truly global standard for recognizing, quantifying the level of an individual's English.
Right.
So the idea is that it replaces any other kind of scale.
Replacing like the CEFR.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I hope they're not using that for their slogan, because
A bit too long,
quite a
right?
long slogan.
Yeah. So the idea is that it allows people, any language learner, to kind of benchmark very clearly their English ability. For whatever reason they're learning language. If they're learning it part of their survey was to find out why people are learning. And so the idea is that no matter why they're learning English and no matter what context they're learning English, their global scale of English will very accurately identify the student's level of English.
Right.
It's on a scale, the scale goes from, you get a score from 10 to 90, and the idea is that it very clearly shows your English. For example, if you score 29 on the scale, you're able to identify and order common food and drinks from a menu. If you score 62, you can write a structured review of a film, book, or play.
Right.
At 74, you can extract the main points from news items with opinions, arguments, and discussion.
So what's the difference between this and the CEFR? Because that's all about can-do statements as well. Is it just that they've put numbers on it?
I think so.
Right.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. They have they released a chart where they show how it relates to the CEFR.
This must relate to the selling of textbooks.
I think so.
Because if you read what you just read there, sounds like the back of a textbook. What you might say in this textbook, you'll be able to order from. It just sounds like a way for them to categorize which learner needs which textbook.
Yeah, if you score between this and this by this textbook.
Exactly.
Which is
So they have done can-do statements for the 4 skills. So at around the 60 level mark in reading, you can do this, and listening, you can do this. My understanding is you just get 1 score for all 4 skills.
Right.
So if you're at a 70 in your reading, but only a 20 in your speaking, I don't know how they
equal out to like 45 or something.
Yeah, which doesn't really tell you anything.
No.
But my feeling is that this is part of, and I think this is something especially Pearson is doing, is trying to standardize these things as much as possible.
Right.
And like you say, it probably is to sell books. So what do you think of this kind of scale?
Well, it seems like, the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, for any listeners who don't know, this was an attempt to standardise already.
Right.
And it was done by, I think, a relatively non-commercial body, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Which makes me trust it more than something that's done by textbook manufacturers. And the fact that they've made this conversion table, I don't really see the advantage of using one over the other. Yeah.
This is all part of Pearson's, what they call their efficacy framework. Efficacy is their big kind of buzzword. And I think their idea is that they're applying it to how they do things themselves,
right?
But also how we can assess students, how we can assess teachers. The way they try to sell it is that it's all going to be based on research or action research or tried and tested measures. But some of the reviews or some of the comments I've seen in blogs about this focuses on this idea of trying to standardize things too much, trying to assign a number to things that kind of resist that kind of categorization.
Right. Which is the problem with all of language testing, really, isn't it? Language assessment, even.
Yeah.
I wonder how this relates to testing, because you can't, for example, if you're applying to live in another country or study in another country, you can't turn up and use this and say, this is my English level.
Yeah.
So I wonder how this relates to testing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think
that would be the next part of this, I guess.
Right.
There'd be some tests that they'd have to take as well.
Yeah.
And other texts.
It was interesting, like you said, about the levels, because I recently took the Japanese language proficiency test, and you get a score there, one for your grammar and reading together, one for your listening, and one for your vocabulary. And I know that one of those sections is going to be much lower down, but if it was averaged out, it would probably come out. I think I failed the test, but if it averaged out, it would come out as a pass.
I see.
So, I mean, that seems like it's not a very useful description of your English, especially if you're using this to decide what materials you're going to use, because some parts of the materials are going to be at a level that you can understand, and some parts are going to be at a level that you can't understand.
Part of what they're also doing with this is pushing digital materials.
Right.
And again, the way that they're pushing it is saying that these are things all based on research that's been done, and it's all evidence-based.
Right.
But I think maybe that's also seems to be a potential backlash towards over-reliance on evidence-based methodologies or techniques.
Right. I mean, what's the advantage of avoiding evidence?
Well, I think the idea is that a piece of research will produce certain results.
Yeah.
And maybe people try to over-apply that to different contexts or different situations, or just different human beings, different teachers who teach in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think it feels like part of what Pearson is doing is trying to standardize things. So saying this is something that through research is shown to work, so everybody should do this.
Right. So I think it's interesting that you said about the individual, because if you look at a test like the IELTS test, in that there is actually human interaction. You do get a score, and there are criteria and stuff, but there's some level of subjectivity to it.
Sure.
And I don't know if you can class. I don't like the idea of someone's language use being reduced down to a number.
Yeah.
I can speak English at level 40. Level 42.
Right. Yeah. Right. And somebody else, I'm a 49 or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, so that's this week's TEFL News.
Thank you for listening to this episode of TEFLology. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology, or you can send an email to teflology@gmail.com.
So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.